All right, welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty intense.
Definitely intense.
Yeah. We're tackling terrorist financing
Yeah.
and, more specifically, the role that those AML professionals,
Mighty money laundering.
anti-money laundering professionals,
It's a
thank you,
briefer.
play in kind of disrupting that whole network.
Right.
So, yeah, we've got a lot to unpack today.
Yeah.
I think, to kind of set the stage, we all know, I think, intuitively, terrorism runs on money, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Without funding, it kind of grinds to a halt.
Right.
But uncovering those financial webs, that's
Yeah.
a whole other story.
It's tricky business.
So for our listeners today, this is really for you if you're interested in kind of global security, financial crime, or really, I think even if you just want to understand how some of these topics that seem a little dry, like AML, have a real impact.
Very real.
In the real world.
Yeah.
So maybe to get us started, can you give us just a quick kind of terrorist financing 101? Like, how does it actually work?
Sure. So, I mean, like any sort of criminal enterprise, it's essentially a cycle.
Okay.
They have to raise the money.
Okay.
They're going to move it around. They have to store it. And then, of course, they have to spend it.
Spend it, yeah.
And so at each point in the cycle, there are vulnerabilities. There are opportunities for us to sort of get in there and disrupt it.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But how's that different from money laundering?
Okay.
Because it seems like on the surface, they're both kind of shady ways of moving money around, right?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, they do share a lot of the same methods, but the goal is really different.
Okay.
So money laundering, you're trying to take dirty money
Right.
and make it look clean,
Okay.
right? You're trying to hide its illegal origins.
Right.
Whereas with terrorist financing, you're really just trying to get the funds to the terrorists.
Yeah.
That doesn't really matter where the money comes from.
So it's about the end goal, not necessarily
Exactly.
the source of the funds.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I remember actually in some of the stuff that we were reading for this deep dive, there was
Oh, yeah.
an interesting analogy about AML professionals
Yes. I love that analogy.
to quarterbacks in the NFL.
Yeah. I think it's very, very apt because like a quarterback, if you got someone who's reading the defense, they're anticipating the plays, they have to react very quickly. And that's kind of what these AML professionals are doing. They have to understand the flow of terrorist financing. They got to identify the key players and then very quickly kind of figure out how to disrupt it.
It's like a chess match almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of those key players,
Mm-hmm.
who are we up against these days? Who are those major actors that we're trying to kind of stay one step ahead of?
So, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they may have lost some of their territory, but they're still major threats.
Okay.
But I think what we see now is that they've gotten really sophisticated with social media.
Right.
And they're not just using it for propaganda.
Right.
They're using it to actually raise funds.
Oh, wow.
So we've seen cases where they're running these crowdfunding campaigns that are disguised as charitable causes.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
that's pretty insidious, honestly.
It's very clever and very, very dangerous.
Yeah. And it's not just those big organizations, right? We also have to worry about state-sponsored terrorism.
Absolutely. And I think that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
So you've got groups like Hezbollah that are backed by Iran,
Right?
and they've got deep pockets. They've got very sophisticated networks that are kind of blending terrorism with other criminal activities.
So they're harder to track.
Much harder to track, yeah.
And then, of course, we have domestic terrorism.
Yes.
Things that hit a little closer to home.
Yeah.
We think about, the Oklahoma City bombing back in 1995.
Right.
So let's talk about the money itself.
Okay.
How are these groups actually getting the cash to do what they do?
Well, if you think about it like a pyramid, right? At the very top, you have what we call funding to organizations.
Okay.
And this is the millions, sometimes billions of dollars these organizations need to just kind of keep the lights on.
Right.
To run their operations.
It's like running a business almost.
It is like running a business.
Uh-huh.
They have budgets, they have logistics.
Yeah. It's a little scary to think about, honestly.
It is.
And then, of course, you have the funding for specific operations, right?
Right, and that's where you're looking at, tens of thousands of dollars for a particular attack.
Got it.
Or a particular campaign.
And then finally, you have that funding for individual operatives.
Yes. So this is kind of the smallest amount, maybe hundreds or a few $1,000s to help those individuals, cover their day-to-day expenses
Yeah.
or fund, smaller scale attacks.
Right, right. Okay, so we've talked about who's funding it and why they're funding it.
Right.
Now, let's get into the how.
Okay.
How are they actually moving this money around without getting caught?
Right. And that's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
And I think, they're using a mix of methods, some old, some new.
Okay.
I mean, you still have the traditional channels, your banks, your wire transfers, your credit cards,
Sure.
but those are obviously heavily monitored.
Right.
So to evade detection, terrorists are increasingly relying on what we call informal systems.
Okay, informal systems like what?
Well, things like Hawala networks.
Oh, wallet networks.
Yeah, so this is actually an ancient trust-based system
Okay.
that's common in South Asia, the Middle East,
Okay.
where money is transferred through a network of brokers, often without any physical movement of cash.
So it's hard to trace.
Extremely hard to trace.
Wow.
You also have bulk cash smuggling, which is literally just moving large amounts of physical currency across borders.
Okay.
And then, believe it or not, you have barter trade, where they're actually exchanging goods for goods
Wow.
to avoid any sort of financial transaction.
So they're going old school.
Very old school.
Interesting. And of course, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the digital world,
Yeah.
right? With things like Bitcoin, these cryptocurrencies becoming more popular.
Yeah, I mean, the digital systems are very attractive to terrorists because they offer anonymity, speed, global reach.
Right.
They can move money very quickly with less risk of detection.
Right. It's the Wild West out there.
It really is.
So with all of these methods, how do AML professionals even begin to kind of break this cycle?
Well, I think it starts with understanding the flow of funds,
Okay.
how the money is raised, how it's moved, how it's stored, and how it's spent. And by visualizing that whole process,
Oh, right.
they can begin to identify those points of intervention.
So it's not just about, flagging a single transaction.
Right.
It's about understanding the whole network.
It's about connecting the dots, recognizing patterns, and seeing that bigger picture.
And staying ahead of the curve, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're always coming up with new tricks.
Constantly, yeah.
Mhm.
They're very good at adapting,
Yeah.
exploiting new technologies, finding new vulnerabilities.
So AML professionals got to be just as quick on their feet.
They have to be constantly learning and evolving their strategies.
Yeah, this has been really fascinating.
Good.
I think it's clear that this terrorist financing it's a real cat and mouse game.
It really is.
But it sounds like those AML professionals are really kind of the front lines of this fight.
They are. And I think, one of the things that keeps me up at night is just how these new technologies, particularly things like digital currencies and online platforms, how are they going to reshape this whole landscape of terrorist financing?
Yeah.
Will we be ready?
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us today on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure.
For our listeners out there, we encourage you to stay informed about this critical issue.
Absolutely.
And, remember that even these fields that seem a little technical, like AML, they have a real impact on global security.
Big time.
All right, we'll catch you all next time.
See you later. Bye.